This next segment is from Melissa Block. When Trump ordered an end to divisive diversity training, NPR jumped on the scene. This interview is from October 30th, 2020. Matt and I are going to listen to it and run through it.
3 civil rights groups have filed a federal lawsuit challenging a recent Trump administration executive order. The order bans certain types of diversity training in the workplace, which the president has railed against, calling it anti-American propaganda. He brought this up at the first presidential debate.
The tone. Notice the tone already?
He's railed against it.
They were teaching people that our country is a horrible place, it's a racist place, and they were teaching people to hate our country.
So with the order, government agencies and contractors are scrambling to figure out how to comply. Here's NPR's Melissa Block.
When Michelle Kim heard about the president's executive order titled Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping,
my first immediate thought was, here we go.
The voice. You notice the voice? It's like a cult voice. It's people who have been doctrinated into the ideology speak with the voice. The social workers who came down freaking out at me from the building had that exact voice.
Kim is co-founder of the company Awaken, which provides workshops on diversity, equity, and inclusion to businesses. And it didn't take long before she heard from a client.
I got an email, let me pull it up. And it said, we request you review your materials and talking points to ensure they do not imply any of the following concepts.
Concepts including the term white privilege.
Let's see. Wouldn't it be nice if we had some kind of what is white privilege? What do you mean by white privilege? Let's actually disambiguate, might be too big of a word, but let's actually try to take an honest, objective look at what this is and what the data is for this.
Which the Trump administration has singled out as potentially problematic, along with systemic racism, unconscious bias.
Okay, unconscious bias is something we can there's evidence against those instruments testing for this. The idea is that people are inherently biased against certain races. We give them a test. There's evidence that we can get into later.
Intersectionality and critical race theory. The executive order states they're all part of a, quote, destructive ideology that threatens to infect core institutions of our country.
Somehow we've gotten to a place where we believe fighting against racism is anti-patriotic.
Whoa.
Okay.
I don't know anybody who holds that view. And I know a lot of conservative people, and I have a lot of friends and family who voted for Trump as well. I don't know anybody who believes that fighting against racism is unpatriotic. That's not the
anti-patriotic, argument. Even worse than unpatriotic.
That's not the argument.
That's not the argument. And it's amazing, instead of criticizing what people actually believe, they make a straw man up and then criticize that. Think about that. Just let that percolate for a second. Fighting against racism is anti-patriotic. Literally, I wouldn't say nobody believes that. Maybe somebody in Arkansas.
Tiny fringe.
Nobody I've ever met thought that.
No.
I've never even heard that in public discourse. But let's see if she lets her get away with that, or says like, well, really? Well, what do you mean? Like, give me an example of someone who says that. Can you please give us one thinker or one piece of writing where that is in the last 25 years? Let's talk about that claim.
That's where we are as a society, and that's a really scary place to be.
Michelle Kim managed to assuage her clients' concerns.
No pushback.
But Joelle Emerson wasn't so lucky. Her company, Paradigm, lost a client, a government contractor that put all of its diversity training on hold. Under the executive order, contracts can be canceled and funding pulled if companies don't comply. Emerson says when that order first came out,
I didn't believe that any of our clients would be fazed by this. I was like, this is clearly propaganda. It's fascist propaganda.
Fascist.
It's a little hyperbolic, maybe.
Fascist propaganda, not mere propaganda, but fascist propaganda. Huh. Really? Okay.
It's a dog whistle to Trump's base. And Organizations that care about diversity, equity, and inclusion are going to be just as offended by this order as we are.
Offended. That's the other currency. That's the other kind of cudgel. Oh, you're going to be offended. Well, in the words of Stephen Fry, so what?
And I was wrong.
The new policy has had widespread and immediate effects. Government agencies, including the Departments of State, Justice, and Veterans Affairs, have all suspended their diversity training programs to review their content. Universities that receive federal funding have done the same, out of fear they could jeopardize their government grants.
It's been a rough few weeks. There's not enough hours in the day.
Chris Gokturk has been fielding a flood of calls from companies with government contracts. She's with the employment law firm Littler Mendelsohn, helping businesses with affirmative action and diversity programs, and they've had a lot of questions.
The most common thing is, should we stop all of our diversity training? Should we just stop? And at first, I said, no, you vetted your training. You always review it and everything else.
Okay, I love that idea.
She's vetted it.
Yeah, she's vetted it.
You can always do it when you vet yourself. You're always going to come out good.
She's vetted it. She's asked other people who participated in the ideology if this is a good idea.
So far, the only people that have been interviewed on this episode are people who make money teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I would love to hear from an actual critic, but we'll see.
I love the idea of vetting something you believe by finding other. It would be like vetting Tai Chi by finding 10 Tai Chi masters or Wing Chun.
Right.
I love this idea of vetting. Okay, but even to explain what it means to vet something, you would have to construct an entire epistemology from somebody.
Well, I think what she could have meant when she said she was going to vet it is she could have vetted her program against what the actual executive order stated, which I think would be interesting to look at, but let's hear what she says.
And then the hotline went up.
A government hotline, phone and email, where people are encouraged to send complaints about diversity training they find offensive for possible investigation.
I wonder if that's what it actually was. Is it because they thought it was offensive? Is that why? The hotline has received more than 140 responses in the 5 weeks it's been up.
Not much.
Stanford sociology professor Shelley Carell is appalled.
This is asking Americans to be surveilling other Americans. And it's chilling. It's absolutely chilling.
Carell studies gender and organizational diversity.
Of course she studies gender and organizational diversity.
Next thing you know, they're going to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion board, and they're going to be coming after people.
Next thing you know.
She fears that chilling effect could extend beyond what's laid out in the executive order and threaten free speech in academia.
Oh, no, it's going to threaten free speech in academia. I mean,
when I think free speech in academia, I think far left for sure.
I mean, just the nerve of that. Like, the very people who are orchestrating campaigns to silence people, the very people who have institutionalized bias response teams, the very people who have created offices in search of tasks to hound people who have weaponized these. Now they're concerned. They're all of a sudden magically concerned about the chilling effect of free speech. The very people who are orchestrating the witch hunts. I mean, it's utterly mind-blowing.
There is a lot of worry that this is just step one and that this is going to lead to restrictions in terms of what we teach in the classroom.
The executive order specifies that divisive concepts can be discussed in an academic setting if it's done objectively and without endorsement.
Yeah, if that's true, you'd have to eliminate entire departments in the university system. Anything with the name studies in it would have to go. They're all ideological. They're all forwarding narratives, forwarding a certain set of axiomatic principles. You'd have to get rid of the whole thing. The whole thing is divisive.
Well, you can't have objective learning at a university, Pete.
Of course not. That's why you have to make up your own epistemology when the facts don't accord to what you believe.
Of course, if Joe Biden were to take office in January, he could undo the order with the stroke of a pen.
There you have it.
Commercial for Joe Biden.
There you have it. Right? That seemed, even for NPR, that seemed a little bit, it was basically advocating, look, here's a huge problem. How do we solve the problem? Joe Biden will solve the problem.
His campaign declined to answer if Biden would rescind this order, but said he intends to tackle all forms of systemic racism.
Systemic. There's the word, systemic.
So I was curious because I have no idea, based on that report, what Trump's executive order actually said or didn't say, because we got no information based on that. We just got basically a straw man argument. So I looked some of it up here, and here's the things that the executive order is meant to stop. Divisive concepts means concept that one race or sex is inherently superior to another, that the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist, that an individual by virtue of her race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously.
Those are the core tenets already of critical race theory. Those are the core tenets of Kennedy's. Those are unpacking the invisible knapsack.
That an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race or sex. That members of one race or sex cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race or sex.
Yeah, those are violations of the concept of equity.
That an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her race or sex. That an individual by virtue of his or her race or sex bears responsibility
Against
for actions
the legacy
committed
of Martin Luther King
in the past members, and that any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or other form of psychological distress on account of his race or sex. So I could keep going through this, but I think if you were to read each one of these off to the majority of Americans, I think the majority of Americans would agree with most of these points. We don't want to treat people differently. Well, I certainly don't want to treat people differently based on race, sex, or gender.
And not only would the majority of Americans agree, this is the Rawls thought experiment. If you didn't know your place in society, every single person who's not embodied in a position, like they don't know their race, their social set, everybody would agree to that.
I think so. I think this is something that the majority of Americans would agree to that. This reads like something Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting for.
And just because...
And I would never know that from the NPR episode.
Just because somebody you don't like says something, it doesn't make it wrong.
Right.
So just because Trump's team, I actually know someone who worked on that. Just because someone on Trump's team or Trump's team puts out something, the default position should not be, this is bad, let's savage it, we need Joe Biden, or we need X person to help us. The position should, if you want to have any intellectual integrity, it should be, what does this say? Can a rational person disagree with this? Is this rooted in evidence? How do we know this is true? How could this be false? Basic questions. You'd never know any of that. In fact, not only would you not know it, the narrative has been constructed so that sane positions are mischaracterized to look insane.
Right.
That was just a fascinating story.
I'm not a Trump fan. I didn't vote for Trump, not that it matters, but I would have never known that had I not taken the time to look that executive order up myself.
And that's not your job, by the way.
No, it should be the journalist's job.
It's the journalist's job to ask those hard questions.
But it has to be our job.
It's not even a hard question. The journalist's job is to say, well, here's the executive order. What in this order do you find problematic?
I got zero information from that NPR clip about what the executive order was actually about or what it said. And after reading it and hearing the clip, their characterization of it was almost backwards.
Correct.
Misinformation, you might say.
Thank you for watching this excerpt from an episode of All Things Reconsidered. To watch the full episode, please follow the link in the description.